Kia ora. Welcome to Campfire Stories. I'm Rose from Christchurch City Libraries, and I'm reading Agatha Christie's The Moving Finger. So far, Jerry has come back from the police station where they've been trying to figure out who the writer of these anonymous letters are. They've narrowed it down to a woman, probably an educated woman, but they haven't got any further than that. When I got home, I found Mrs. Dane Calthrop sitting talking to Joanna. She looked, I thought, grey and ill. "This has been a terrible shock to me, Mr. Burton," she said. "Poor thing, poor thing." "Yes," I said, "it's awful to think of someone being driven to the stage of taking one's own life." "Oh, you mean Mrs. Symington?" "Didn't you?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop shook her head. "Of course, one is sorry for her, but it would have been bound to happen anyway, wouldn't it?" "Would it?" said Joanna dryly. Mrs. Dane Calthrop turned to her. "Oh, I think so, dear. If suicide is your idea of escape from trouble, then it doesn't very much matter what the trouble is. Whenever some very unpleasant shock had to be faced, she'd have done the same thing. What it really comes down to is that she was that kind of woman. Not that one would have guessed it. She always seemed to me a rather selfish, rather stupid woman, with a good firm hold on life, not the kind of panic you would think. But I'm beginning to realise how little I really know anyone." "I'm still curious as to whom you meant when you said 'poor thing,'" I remarked. She stared at me. "The woman who wrote the letters, of course." "I don't think," I said dryly, "I shall waste sympathy on her." Mrs. Dane Calthrop leaned forward and she laid a hand on my knee. "But don't you realise, can't you feel? Use your imagination. Think how desperately, violently unhappy anyone must be to sit down and write those things. How lonely, how cut off from humankind. Poisoned through and through, with a dark stream of poison that finds its outlet in this way. That's why I feel so self-reproachful. Somebody in this town has been racked with that terrible unhappiness, and I had no idea of it." "I should have had. You can't interfere with actions, I never do, but that black inward unhappiness, like a septic arm physically, all black and swollen, if you could cut it and let that poison out, it would flow away harmlessly. Yes, poor soul, poor soul." She got up to go. I did not feel like agreeing with her. I had no sympathy for our anonymous letter writer whatsoever, but I did ask curiously, "Have you any idea, Mrs. Calthrop, who this woman is?" She turned her fine, perplexed eyes on me. "Well, I can guess," she said, "but then I might be wrong, mightn't I?" She went swiftly out through the door, popping her head back to ask, "Do tell me, why have you never married, Mr. Burton?" In anyone else it would have been an impertinence, but with Mrs. Dane Calthrop you felt that the idea had suddenly come into her head and she really had wanted to know. "Shall we say," I said, rallying, "that I have never met the right woman?" "We can say so," said Mrs. Dane Calthrop, "but it wouldn't be a very good answer, because so many men have obviously married the wrong woman." This time she really departed. Joanna said, "You know, I really do think she's mad, but I like her. The people in the village here are afraid of her." "So am I, a little." "Because you never really know what's coming next?" "Yes, and there's a careless brilliancy about her guesses." Joanna said slowly, "Do you really think whoever wrote those letters is very unhappy?" "I don't know what the damned hag is thinking or feeling, and I don't care. It's her victims I'm sorry for." It seems odd to me now that in our speculations about Poison Pen's frame of mind, we missed the most obvious one. Griffith had pictured her as possibly exultant. I had envisaged her as remorseful, appalled by the result of her handiwork. Mrs. Dane Calthrop had seen her as suffering. Yet the obvious, the inevitable reaction we did not consider, or perhaps I should say I did not consider, that reaction was fear. For with the death of Mrs. Symington, the letters had passed out of one category into another. I don't know what the legal position was. Symington knew, I suppose, but it was clear that with a death resulting, the position of the writer of the letters was much more serious. There could now be no question of passing it off as a joke if the identity of the writer was discovered. The police were active, a Scotland Yard expert called in. It was vital now for the anonymous author to remain anonymous. And granted that fear was the principal reaction, other things followed. Those possibilities also I was blind to, yet surely they should have been obvious. Joanna and I came down rather late to breakfast the next morning, that is to say, late by the standards of Lymstock. It was 9:30, an hour at which in London Joanna was just unclosing an eyelid, and mine would probably be still tight shut. However, when Partridge had said breakfast at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, neither Joanna nor I had the nerve to suggest a later hour. To my annoyance, Amy Griffith was standing on the doorstep talking to Megan. She gave tongue with her usual heartiness at the sight of us. "Hello there, slackers. I've been up for hours." That, of course, was her own business. A doctor, no doubt, has to have early breakfast, and a dutiful sister is there to pour out his tea or coffee. But it is no excuse for coming and butting in on one's more somnolent neighbours. 9:30 is not the time for a morning call. Megan slipped back into the house and into the dining room, where I gathered she had been interrupted in her breakfast. "I said I wouldn't come in," said Amy Griffith, though why it is more of a merit to force people to come and speak to you on the doorstep than to talk to them inside the house I do not know. "I just wanted to ask Miss Burton if she'd had any vegetables to spare for our Red Cross stall on the main road. If so, I'd get Owen to call for them in the car." "You're out and about very early," I said. "The early bird catches the worm," said Amy. "You have a better chance of finding people at this time of day. I'm off to Mr. Pye's next. Got to go over to Brenton this afternoon. Guides." "Your energy makes me quite tired," I said, and at that moment the telephone rang, and I retired to the back of the hall to answer it, leaving Joanna murmuring rather doubtfully something about rhubarb and French beans, and exposing her ignorance of the vegetable garden. "Yes," I said into the telephone mouthpiece. A confused noise of deep breathing came from the other end of the wire, and a doubtful female voice said, "Oh." "Yes," I said again encouragingly. "Oh," said the voice, and then it inquired, is that Little Furs?" "This is Little Furs." "Oh." This was clearly a stock beginning to every sentence. The voice inquired cautiously, "Could I speak to Miss Partridge for just a minute?" "Certainly," I said. "Who shall I say?" "Oh, tell her it's Agnes, would you? Agnes Waddle." "Agnes Waddle? That's right." Resisting the temptation to say "Donald Duck to you," I put down the telephone receiver and called up the stairs to where I could hear the sound of Partridge's activities overheard. "Partridge! Partridge!" Partridge appeared at the head of the stairs, a long mop in one hand and a look of "What is it now?" clearly discernible behind her invariably respectful manner. "Yes, sir?" "Agnes Waddle wants to speak to you on the telephone." "I beg your pardon, sir?" I raised my voice. "Agnes Waddle." I have spelt the name as it presented myself to my mind, but I will spell it now as it was actually written. Agnes Waddle, Woddell. Whatever can she want now? Very much put out of countenance, Partridge relinquished her mop and rustled down the stairs, her print dress crackling with agitation. I bet an unobtrusive retreat into the dining room where Megan was wolfing down kidneys and bacon. Megan, unlike Amy Griffith, was displaying no glorious morning face. In fact, she replied very gruffly to my morning salutations and continued to eat in silence. I opened the morning paper, and a minute or two later Joanna entered, looking somewhat shattered. "Whew," she said, "I'm so tired. And I think I've exposed my utter ignorance of what grows when. Aren't there runner beans this time of year? August, said Megan. Well, one has them any time in London, said Joanna defensively. Tins, sweet fool, I said, and cold storage on ships from the far-flung limits of empire. Like ivory, apes and peacocks, asked Joanna. Exactly. I'd rather have peacocks, said Joanna thoughtfully. I'd like a monkey of my own as a pet, said Megan. Meditatively peeling an orange, Joanna said, I wonder what it would feel like to be Amy Griffith, all bursting with health and vigour and enjoyment of life. Do you think she's ever tired or depressed or wistful? I said I was quite certain Amy Griffith was never wistful, and followed Megan out of the open French window onto the veranda. Standing there filling my pipe, I heard Partridge enter the dining room from the hall, and I heard her voice say grimly, Can I speak to you a minute, miss? Dear me, I thought. I hope Partridge isn't going to give notice. Emily Barton will be very annoyed with us if so. Partridge went on, I must apologise, miss, for being rung up on the telephone. That is to say, the young person who did so should have known better. I have never been in the habit of using the telephone or of permitting my friends to ring me up on it, and I'm very sorry indeed that it should have occurred and the master taken the call and everything. Why, that's quite all right, Partridge, said Joanna soothingly. Why shouldn't your friends use the phone if they want to speak to you? Partridge's face, I could feel, though I could not see it, was more dour than ever as she replied coldly, It's not the kind of thing that has ever been done in this house. Miss Emily would never permit it. As I say, I am sorry it occurred, but Agnes Waddle, the girl who did it, was upset, and she's young too, and doesn't know what's fitting in a gentleman's house. That's one for you, Joanna, I thought gleefully. This Agnes who rung me up, miss, went on Partridge. She used to be in service here under me. 16 she was then, and came straight from the orphanage. And you see, not having a home or a mother or any relations to advise her, she's been in the habit of coming to me. I can tell her what's what, you see. Yes, said Joanna, and waited. Clearly there was more to follow. So I am taking the liberty of asking you, miss, if you would allow Agnes to come here to tea this afternoon in the kitchen. It's her day out, you see, and she's got something in her mind she wants to consult me about. I wouldn't dream of suggesting such a thing in the usual way. Joanna said, bewildered, But why shouldn't you have anyone to tea with you? Partridge drew herself up at this, so Joanna said afterwards, and really looking most formidable as she replied, It has never been the custom of this house, miss. Old Mrs. Barton never allowed visitors in the kitchen, excepting as it should be our own day out, in which case we were allowed to entertain friends here instead of going out, but otherwise, on ordinary days, no. And Miss Emily, she keeps to the old ways. Joanna is very nice to servants, and most of them like her, but she has never cut any ice with Partridge. It's no good, my girl, I said when Partridge had gone and Joanna had joined me outside. Your sympathy and leniency are not appreciated. The good old overbearing ways for Partridge, and things done the way they should be done in a gentleman's house. I never heard of such tyranny as not allowing them to have their friends to see them, said Joanna. It's all very well, Jerry, but they can't like being treated like slaves. Evidently they do, I said. At least the Partridges of this world do. I can't imagine why she doesn't like me. Most people do. She probably despises you as an inadequate housekeeper. You never draw the hand across a shelf and examine it for traces of dust. You don't look under the mats. You don't ask what happened to the remains of the chocolate souffle, and you never order a nice bread pudding. Oh, said Joanna. She went on sadly, I'm a failure all round today, despised by our Amy for ignorance of the vegetable kingdom, snubbed by Partridge for being a human being. I shall now go out into the garden and eat worms. Megan's there already, I said. For Megan had wandered away a few minutes previously and was now standing aimlessly in the middle of a patch of lawn, looking not unlike a meditative bird waiting for nourishment. She came back, however, towards us and said abruptly, I say, I must go home today. What? I said. I was dismayed. She went on, flushing, but speaking with nervous determination. "It's been awfully good of you having me, and I expect I've been a fearful nuisance, but I have enjoyed it awfully. Only now I must go back, because after all, well, it's my home, and one can't stay away forever, so I think I'll go this morning." Both Joanna and I tried to make her change her mind, but she was quite adamant, and finally Joanna got out the car and Megan went upstairs and came down a few minutes later with her belongings packed up once again. The only person pleased seemed to be Partridge, who almost had a smile on her grim face. She had never liked Megan much. I was standing in the middle of the lawn when Joanna returned. She asked me if I thought I was a sundial. Why? Standing there like a garden ornament. Only one couldn't put you on the motto of only marking the sunny hours. You look like thunder. I'm out of humour. First Amy Griffith. Gracious, murmured Joanna in parenthesis. I must speak about those vegetables. And then Megan beetling off. I'd thought of taking her for a walk up League Tor. With a collar and lead, I suppose, said Joanna. What? Joanna repeated loudly and clearly as she moved off round the corner of the house to the kitchen garden. I said, with a collar and lead, I suppose. Master's lost his dog. That's what's the matter with you. I was annoyed, I must confess, at the abrupt way in which Megan had left us. Perhaps she had suddenly got bored with us. After all, it wasn't a very amusing life for a girl. At home she'd got the kids and Elsie Holland. I heard Joanna returning and hastily moved in case she should make more rude remarks about sundials. Owen Griffith called in his car just before lunchtime, and the gardener was waiting for him with the necessary garden produce. Whilst old Adams was stowing it in the car, I brought Owen indoors for a drink. He wouldn't stay to lunch. When I came in with the sherry, I had found Joanna had begun doing her stuff. No signs of animosity now. She was curled up in the corner of the sofa and was positively purring, asking Owen questions about his work, if he liked being a GP, if he wouldn't rather have specialised. She thought doctoring was one of the most fascinating things in the world. Say what you will of her, Joanna is a lovely, heaven-born listener. And after listening to so many would-be geniuses telling her how they had been unappreciated, listening to Owen Griffith was easy money. By the time we had got to the third glass of sherry, Griffith was telling her about some obscure reaction or lesion in such scientific terms that nobody could have understood a word of it except a fellow medico. Joanna was looking intelligent and deeply interested. I felt a moment's qualm. It was really too bad of Joanna. Griffith was too good a chap to be played fast and loose with. Women really were devils. Then I caught a sideways view of Griffith, his long, purposeful chin and the grim set of his lips, and I was not so sure that Joanna was going to have it her own way after all. And anyway, a man has no business to let himself be made a fool of by a woman. It's his own lookout if he does. Then Joanna said, "Do change your mind and stay to lunch with us, Dr. Griffith." And Griffith flushed a little and said he would, only his sister would be expecting him back. "We'll ring her up and explain," said Joanna quickly, and went out into the hall and did so. I thought Griffith looked a little uneasy, and it crossed my mind that he was probably a little afraid of his sister. Joanna came back smiling and said that it was all right. And Owen Griffith stayed to lunch and seemed to enjoy himself. We talked about books and plays and world politics and about music and painting and modern architecture. We didn't talk about Lymstock at all, or about anonymous letters, or Mrs. Symington's suicide. We got right away from everything, and I think Owen Griffith was happy. His dark, sad face lighted up, and he revealed an interesting mind. When he had gone, I said to Joanna, "That fellow's too good for your tricks." Joanna said, "That's what you say. You men all stick together." "Why were you out after his hide, Joanna? Wounded vanity?" "Perhaps," said my sister. That afternoon we were to go to tea with Miss Emily Barton at her rooms in the village. We strolled down there on foot, for I felt strong enough now to manage the hill back again. We must actually have allowed too much time and got there early, for the door was opened to us by a tall, raw-boned, fierce-looking woman who told us that Miss Barton wasn't in yet. "But she's expecting you, I know, so if you'll come up and wait, please." This, evidently, was faithful Florence. We followed her up the stairs, and she threw open a door and showed us into what was quite a comfortable sitting room, though perhaps a little over-furnished. Some of the things, I suspected, had come from Little Furs. The woman was clearly proud of her room. "It's nice, isn't it?" she demanded. "Very nice," said Joanna warmly. "I make her as comfortable as I can. Not that I can do for her as I'd like to and in the way she ought to have. She ought to be in her own house properly, not turned out into rooms." Florence, who was clearly a dragon, looked from one to the other of us reproachfully. It was not, I felt, our lucky day. Joanna had been ticked off by Amy Griffith and Partridge, and now we were both being ticked off by the dragon Florence. Excuse me. "Parlourmaid I was for 15 years there," she added. Joanna, goaded by injustice, said, "Well, Miss Barton wanted to let the house. She put it down at the house agent's." "Forced to do it," said Florence, "and she living so frugal and careful. But even then, the government can't leave her alone. Has to have its pound of flesh just the same." I shook my head sadly. "Plenty of money there was in the old lady's time," said Florence, "and then they all died off, one by one, poor dears. Miss Emily nursing one of them, one after the other. Wore herself out, she did, and always so patient and uncomplaining. But it told on her, and then had to have to worry about money on top of it all. Shares not bringing in what they used to, so she says, and why not, I should like to know? They ought to be ashamed of themselves, doing down a lady like her who's got no head for figures and can't be up to their tricks." "Practically everyone has been hit that way," I said, but Florence remained unsoftened. "It's all right for some as can look after themselves, but not for her. She needs looking after, and as long as she's with me, I'm going to see no one imposes on her or upsets her in any way. I'd do anything for Miss Emily." And glaring at us for some moments in order to drive that point thoroughly home, the indomitable Florence left the room, carefully shutting the door behind her. "Do you feel like a bloodsucker, Jerry?" inquired Joanna. "Because I do. What's the matter with us?" "We don't seem to be going down very well," I said. "Megan gets tired of us. Partridge disapproves of you. Faithful Florence disapproves of both of us." Joanna murmured, "I wonder why Megan did leave." "She got bored." "I don't think she did at all. I wonder, do you think, Jerry, it could have been something that Amy Griffith said?" "You mean this morning when they were talking on the doorstep?" "Yes, there wasn't much time, of course, but—" I finished the sentence. "But that woman's got the tread of a cow elephant. She might have—" The door opened and Miss Emily came in. She was pink and a little out of breath and seemed excited. Her eyes were very blue and shining. She chirruped at us in quite a distracted manner. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry I'm late. Just doing a little shopping in the town, and the cakes at the Blue Rose didn't seem to me quite fresh, so I went on to Mrs. Lygon's. I always like to get my cakes the last thing. Then one gets the newest batch just out of the oven, and one isn't put off with the day before's. But I'm so distressed to have kept you waiting, really unpardonable." Joanna cut in. "It's our fault, Miss Barton. We're early. We walk down and Jerry strides along so fast now that we arrive everywhere too soon." "Never too soon, dear. Don't say that. One cannot have too much of a good thing, you know." And the old lady patted Joanna affectionately on the shoulder. Joanna brightened up. At last, so it seemed, she was being a success. Emily Barton extended her smile to include me, but with a slight timidity in it, rather as one might approach a man-eating tiger guaranteed for the moment harmless. "It's very good of you to come to such a feminine meal as tea, Mr. Barton." Emily Barton, I think, has a mental picture of men as interminably consuming whiskies and sodas and smoking cigars, and in the intervals dropping out to do a few seductions of village maidens or to conduct a liaison with a married woman. When I said this to Joanna later, she replied that it was probably wishful thinking, and that Emily Barton would have liked to have come across such a man, but alas, never had done so. In the meantime, Miss Emily was fussing round the room, arranging Joanna and myself with little tables and carefully providing ashtrays, and a minute later the door opened and Florence came in bearing a tray of tea with some fine Crown Derby cups on it, which I gathered Miss Emily had brought with her. The tea was china and delicious, and there were plates of sandwiches and thin bread and butter, and a quantity of little cakes. Florence was beaming now, and looked at Miss Emily with a kind of maternal pleasure, as at a favourite child enjoying a doll's tea party. Joanna and I ate far more than we wanted to. Our hostess pressed us so earnestly. The little lady was clearly enjoying her tea party, and I perceived that, to Emily Barton, Joanna and I were a big adventure, two people from the mysterious world of London and sophistication. Naturally, our talk soon dropped into local channels. Miss Barton spoke warmly of Dr. Griffith, his kindness and his cleverness as a doctor. Mr. Symington, too, was a very clever lawyer, and had helped Miss Barton to get some money back from the income tax which she would never have known about. He was so nice to his children, too, devoted to them and to his wife. She caught herself up. Poor Mrs. Symington, it's so dreadfully sad with those young children left motherless. Never perhaps a very strong woman, and her health had been bad of late. A brainstorm, that is what it must have been. I read about such a thing in the paper. People really do not know what they are doing under those circumstances, and she can't have been knowing what she was doing, or else she would have remembered Mr. Symington and the children. That anonymous letter must have shaken her up very badly, said Joanna. Miss Barton flushed. She said with a tinge of reproof in her voice, "Not a very nice thing to discuss, do you think, dear? I know there have been letters, but we won't talk about them. Nasty things. I think they are better just ignored." Well, Miss Barton might be able to ignore them, but for some people it wasn't so easy. However, I obediently changed the subject, and we discussed Amy Griffith. "Wonderful, quite wonderful," said Emily Barton. "Her energy and her organising powers are really splendid. She's so good with girls too, and she's so practical and up-to-date in every way. She really runs this place, and absolutely devoted to her brother. It's very nice to see such devotion between brother and sister." "Doesn't he ever find her a bit overwhelming?" asked Joanna. Emily Barton stared at her in a startled fashion. "She has sacrificed a great deal for his sake," she said with a touch of reproachful dignity. I saw a touch of "oh, yea" in Joanna's eye, and hastened to divert the conversation to Mr. Pye. Emily Barton was a little dubious about Mr. Pye. All she could say was, repeated rather doubtfully, that he was very kind, yes, very kind, very well off too, and most generous. He had very strange visitors sometimes, but then of course he had travelled a lot. We agreed that travel not only broadened the mind, but occasionally resulted in the forming of strange acquaintances. "I have often wished myself to go on a cruise," said Miss Barton wistfully. "One reads about them in the papers, and they sound so attractive." "Why don't you go?" asked Joanna. This turning of a dream into a reality seemed to alarm Miss Emily. "Oh, no, no, that would be quite impossible." "But why? They're fairly cheap." "Oh, it's not only the expense, but I shouldn't like to go alone. Travelling alone would look very peculiar, don't you think?" "No," said Joanna. Miss Emily looked at her doubtfully. "And I don't know how I would manage about my luggage, and going ashore at foreign ports, and all the different currencies." Innumerable pitfalls seemed to rise up before the little lady's affrighted gaze, and Joanna hastened to calm her by a question about an approaching garden fete and sale of work. This led us quite naturally to Mrs. Dane Calthrop. A faint spasm showed for a minute on Miss Barton's face. "You know, dear," she said, "she really is a very odd woman. The things she says sometimes." I asked what things. "Oh, I don't know, such very unexpected things, and the way she looks at you, as though you weren't there, but somebody else was. I'm expressing it badly, but it is so hard to convey the impression I mean. And then she won't, interfere at all. There are so many cases where a vicar's wife could advise, and perhaps admonish, pull people up, and make them mend their ways. Because people would listen to her, I'm sure of that. They're all quite in awe of her, but she insists on being aloof and far away, and has such a curious habit of feeling sorry for the most unworthy people." "That's interesting," I said, exchanging a quick glance with Joanna. "Still, she's a very well-bred woman. She was a Miss Farraway of Belpath, very good family, but these old families sometimes are a little peculiar, I believe. But she is devoted to her husband, who is a man of very fine intellect. Wasted, I am sometimes afraid, in this country circle. A good man and most sincere, but I always find his habit of quoting Latin a very little confusing. Hear, hear, I said fervently. Jerry had an expensive public school education, so he doesn't recognise Latin when he hears it, said Joanna. This led Miss Barton to a new topic. The schoolmistress here is a most unpleasant young woman, she said. Quite red, I'm afraid. She lowered her voice over the word red. Later, as we walked home up the hill, Joanna said to me, She's rather sweet. At dinner that night, Joanna said to Partridge that she hoped her tea party had been a success. Partridge got rather red in the face and held herself even more stiffly. Thank you, miss, but Agnes never turned up at all. Oh, I'm sorry. It doesn't matter to me, said Partridge. She was so swelling with grievance that she condescended to pour it out to us. It wasn't me who thought of asking her. She rang up herself, said she'd something on her mind, and could she come here, it being her day off, and I said yes, subject to your permission, which I obtained, and after that not a sound nor sign of her, and no word of apology either, though I should hope I'll get a postcard tomorrow morning. These girls nowadays don't know their place, no idea of how to behave. Joanna attempted to soothe Partridge's wounded feelings. She mayn't have felt well. You didn't ring up to find out? Partridge drew herself up again. No, I did not, miss. No, indeed. If Agnes likes to behave rudely, that's her lookout, but I shall give her a piece of my mind when we meet. Partridge went out of the room, still stiff with indignation, and Joanna and I laughed. Probably a case of advice from Aunt Nancy's column, I said. My boy is very cold in his manner to me. What shall I do about it? Failing Aunt Nancy, Partridge was to be applied to for advice, but instead there has been a reconciliation, and I expect at this minute that Agnes and her boy are one of those speechless couples locked in each other's arms that you come across suddenly standing by a dark hedge. They embarrass you horribly, but you don't embarrass them. Joanna laughed, and she said she expected that was it. We began talking of the anonymous letters and wondered how Nash and the melancholy Graves were getting on. It's a week today exactly, said Joanna, since Mrs. Symington's suicide. I should think they must have got on to something by now, fingerprints or handwriting or something. I answered her absently. Somewhere behind my conscious mind a queer uneasiness was growing. It was connected in some way with the phrase that Joanna had used, a week exactly. I ought, I dare say, to have put two and two together earlier. Perhaps unconsciously my mind was already suspicious. Anyway, the leaven was working now. The uneasiness was growing, coming to a head. Joanna noticed suddenly that I wasn't listening to her spirited account of a village encounter. What's the matter, Jerry? I did not answer because my mind was busy piecing things together. Mrs. Symington's suicide. She was alone in the house that afternoon. Alone in the house because the maids were having their day out. A week ago exactly. Jerry, what? I interrupted. Joanna, maids have days out once a week, don't they? And alternate Sundays, said Joanna. What on? Never mind Sundays. They go out the same day every week? Yes, that's the usual thing. Joanna was staring at me curiously. Her mind had not taken the track mine had done. I crossed the room and rang the bell. Partridge came. Tell me, I said, this Agnes Waddle, she's in service? Yes, sir, at Mrs. Symington's. At Mr. Symington's, I should say now. I drew a deep breath. I glanced at the clock. It was 10:30. Would she be back now, do you think? Partridge was looking disapproving. Yes, sir. The maids have to be in by 10 there. They're old-fashioned. I said, I'm going to ring up. I went out to the hall. Joanna and Partridge followed me. Partridge was clearly furious. Joanna was puzzled. She said, as I was trying to get the number, What are you going to do, Jerry? I'd like to be sure that the girl has come in all right. Partridge sniffed. Just sniffed, nothing more, but I did not care twopence about Partridge's sniffs. Elsie Holland answered the telephone the other end. Sorry to ring you up, I said. This is Jerry Burton speaking. Has Your maid Agnes come in?" It was not until after I had said it that I suddenly felt a bit of a fool, for if the girl had come in and was all right, how on earth was I going to explain my ringing up and asking? It would have been better if I had let Joanna ask the question, though even that would have needed a bit of explaining. I foresaw a new trail of gossip starting in Lymstock with myself and the unknown Agnes Waddle at its centre. Elsie Holland sounded not unnaturally very much surprised. Agnes? Oh, she's sure to be in by now. I felt a fool, but I went on with it. Do you mind just seeing if she has come in, Miss Holland? There is one thing to be said for a nursery governess. She is used to doing things when told. Hers not to reason why. Elsie Holland put down the receiver and went off obediently. 2 minutes later I heard her voice. Are you there, Mr. Burton? Yes. Agnes isn't in yet, as a matter of fact. I knew then my hunch had been right. I heard a noise of voices vaguely from the other end. Then Symington himself spoke. Hello, Burton, what's the matter? Your maid Agnes isn't back yet? No. Miss Holland has just been to see. What's the matter? There hasn't been an accident, has there? Not an accident, I said. Do you mean you have reason to believe something has happened to the girl? I said grimly. I shouldn't be surprised. Well, I wonder what's happened to Agnes. The plot's getting thicker. That's enough for today. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.